turn live captions on so you can read what's being said in the moment, and you can change the background for your video and see your own device settings in case you need to change anything on your end. Okay, so with that being said, by the end of today's training, you are going to have access to all the training materials, and I will be putting this link in the chat as well. We're going to go over today's PowerPoints and any additional documents. They are all in a specific webpage for you to access and download as well. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it off to Miss Cheryl, and she will be sharing her screen now.
Can you see it, Cora?
I just stopped sharing, so you should be able to share yours now.
Can you see it?
Not yet.
Okay. And we'd all like to apologize because this is a brand new platform for us.
Yes, but it's okay. It's a learning curve, and we're going to get through it. So just
can you see that?
Your screen. Yes. Just
can you see it?
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go. Success. So now I see your screen. And there's
can still see it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Awesome.
Here we go, guys. Wish us luck. This is the first time on this one. Welcome to Admissions and Occupancy. We're going to go from 2 to 4 every day. Welcome, and I guess I should change myself for good afternoon rather than good morning. A little bit of information about myself. It'll be at the beginning and the ending of every one of the sessions. You are being recorded. This webinar is. And if you could throw some information about yourself in the chat box. It wasn't really showing me what you were saying, but I'm usually busy anyway. So that's one of the reasons Cora is here, is to help with some of the questions. A little bit about myself. My name is Cheryl. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman. I'm Loon Clan, and I come from Place of the Pike, Bay Mills. Our reservation in Bay Mills is located at the top of Michigan. Our waters border Canada, and we are Ojibwe Chippewa people. I was director of housing for my tribe for over 28 years. And I was also honored to serve as the chairwoman of the National American Indian Housing Council for a 4-year term. And I sat on the board of directors as the vice chair and the secretary for an additional 12 years. So I spent 16 years with that organization, as well as serving as the chairwoman for the Great Lakes for 7 years. I've been providing TNTA for a little bit over 2 years now, and I enjoy it because I still get to help people. So our course structure, presentation, there's a couple exercises in there, participant materials, examples, references, and there is a whole lot of, we'll get to some of the appendix items because I would definitely suggest you look at them and download them. We have a huge class, well over 150, so you're going to probably keep hearing that beep, beep, beep as people come in. I guess a lot of people wanted admissions and occupancy right now. So the course description, we're going to cover admissions and occupancy program management with topics to include the application and the selection process. We're going to go over eligibility for housing, calculating annual income, determining monthly rental or home ownership payments, occupancy standards, collection practices, compliance, effective communication techniques with residents, lease agreement communication techniques with residents as far as that. Participants should also consider your own admissions and occupancy policies. So you could consider practice applying them to the case studies or comparing them to see if you have the same type of content. We're also going to examine how maintaining high standards within your admissions and your occupancy will affect your overall management of your tribal housing programs. Upon completion of this training, hopefully you should be able to understand NAHASDA, your tribal housing policies, your other program requirements, how it admits or it impacts your admission in your occupancy programs. It should improve job performance related to admission and occupancy issues, learn the application and admission processes for applicants and residents, understand what requirements should be included in admission, occupancy, and collection policies, and calculate the annual income to determine income eligibility for your assisted programs. So we're going to work on learning the calculations of adjusted gross income, to calculate those monthly housing payments, to know the process for and the importance of verifying your applicant information, understanding the legal and the financial implications of the collections and lease compliance, the importance and the benefits of effective collection and in compliance with your policies and your procedures, and recognizing the essential steps in the eviction process and how basically that works. So under section 1, we're going to go through the introduction, your purpose in NAHASDA, eligible families, tribal preference and selection, applicable income limits, the definitions basically of low income and gross income, eligible activities, the required policies you have to have within NAHASDA, occupancy, maintenance and inspection, insurance, useful life, the environmental requirements, your uniform relocation assistance, some of your other funders requirements, conflict of interest, establishing your admission and your occupancy policy, your programs and your services. There's your A&O program is huge. It's one of the most important components of your whole housing program. Your staffing requirements, your file management, statutory and regulatory requirements that you have to have in place, and your legal responsibility to your tenants. Some of your file requirements, your criminal record information, drug abuse treatment information, how it's supposed to be stored, your file organization and retrieval, and maintaining those housing counseling files. Your recipient responsibilities, that'll be tomorrow. We'll be touching on that part. Written application, eligibility screening, different programs, different processes. And when you go to interview your applicant, that's a huge part of it. Income under NAHASDA, your annual income defined, whose income you count, types of income. When you're dealing with income from self-employment, if they have enough, no income at all, not enough, Social Security income, calculating alimony, child support. So right now I'm running through the whole course, but this is going to be split within 4 days. We'll be speaking to child custody and support payments, military pay, methods for computing Part 5 annual income, no assets, anticipated income, annual income, and there's a practice summary there. What to include as an asset, and your actual, yes. I can hear somebody. Crystal, I think I can hear you in the background. Assets owned jointly, 2 unique rules. When assets are disposed of at less than fair market value, and the summary of items that need to be considered. So census definition, Internal Revenue Service definition of income. There's 3 different definitions you can use, and which ones you're going to use. Section 5 is going to deal with calculating your adjusted gross income, NAHASDA allowances for dependents, families that share custody, how you're going to do that deduction, your eligibility and disabled deduction, medical and attendant expense deduction.
Finally.
I'm hearing some background feed here. I don't know who I'm listening to, but
now bear with us as more people come into the training, Cheryl. It takes us a few seconds to make them attendees so they can't unmute themselves. If they're joining in unmuted, that's what you're going to hear. So we're working on it. I got you.
No worries. Yeah, and I don't know if the rest of the class hears it, but I hear every beep that you let somebody in.
No, it
So
should just
that's
be us. So
okay.
hopefully we got the brunt of it.
Yeah, guys, that would be interesting. There's 150 some beeps so far, it sounds like. So, section 5 is calculating adjusted gross income, how it's adjusted, your elderly and your disabled households, allowances for childcare, your earned income of your minors, excessive travel expenses, and other amounts. I was surprised how many people that I ran across that don't give the travel, excessive travel allowance. Total tenant payment, low income computation issues, if you're going to charge a flat rent, less than 30%, when a family is considered low income. So we've got quite a few, there's a lot here. Processing your applications, verifying social security, the different types of verification, third, second,
Holly, can you
first.
come and get me on here, please?
Timing of income certifications, verification forms, provisions for refusal to sign, and waitlist organization, preferences, priorities, placement on the waiting list, updating of it. NAHASDA tenant and home buyer selection plans, selection criteria, overview of the selection process, and general guidelines for unit size. We're going to talk about A&O issues with other programs, down payment assistance, lease purchase, rehab, weatherization, home repair, the management and compliance side of it for your dwelling leases, your exclusions, your lease purchase agreement, orientation, compliance issues, maintenance, your initial inspections, your reoccurring inspections requirements. You get a lot of people get tagged on that. Scheduling, timing of recertification. So our last couple of sections is housing counseling and your goals and the services. Our collection policies, when we have to unfortunately evict somebody. Of course, the benefit of collections, credit basics,
Comes on. Oh, there it is. Okay.
case management, collection tips, active listening and communication, and we've got a small section on HUD monitoring, and a huge amount of appendix documents that I spoke about. And yes, wow, that was a lot. So these are our appendix documents that she will hit upon at the end again. She told us at the beginning, but I think I've heard 70 beeps since then, so quite a few have joined. But this is the list of appendix documents that we will have available, all of these different items here. And some of them are pretty good, and maybe you would consider looking at them and downloading them and using them within your organization. This is the overview of the 4 days. I'm going to try to give you a break between 3 and 3:15. I don't know how close I'm going to get, and it dependent upon how we get through this content. Like I said, it's depends on how the class goes and the pace. So we're going to start with the overview of the NAHASDA requirements. And NAHASDA is basically, you've got to go through the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. It provides funds annually to assist the tribes and Alaska Native corporations and villages to provide housing assistance for our people. Although tribes through exercise of self-determination can actually design their own programs and their organizational delivery of affordable housing, they have to do it within the statutory and the regulatory requirements of NAHASDA. I'm going to go back up here. This very first one is the NAHASDA statute. The second appendix item here is CFR 24. And if you come down, I don't know if you can see it, the last, I believe it's 29 in here, is the 200 guidance. Now those 3 books, a lot of times the people within A&O, your occupancy specialist and things like that aren't real familiar with how we got where we are or how we go into searching to find out things. So There are 3 documents, which I just listed, that everybody there could have. I keep them, you can put them on your computer, but I also have them printed. This is 200. This is everything to do with procurement. That's about how big that document would be. The NAHASDA statute and the Code of Federal Regulations can fit within one book like this. But I will point out how it will constantly refer to these, and this is the legal background as to why you have to do things, or why you can't, or show me where it says that I can't do it. You should really try to become very, very familiar with those. The more you work with them, the better off you will be. So Section 1 will provide a brief introduction basically into those NAHASDA requirements that have to be considered when you develop and you implement your A&O program. Whether you're huge, Aquasasni is in the house. Hey guys, I saw a couple of you on there. It's nice to see your beautiful faces. I wish I could, reach out and hug you. And then small ones. There's a lady I had come on, and I think there's 3 of them within their housing department, maybe 2. So they vary in size. I've seen them run from 50, like I said, all the way to 1 and a maintenance guy. So sometimes there's one person that does it all. Other times there's one person that only has one little portion of the stuff. But we all have to follow the same rules. So some of us get to know our portion a little bit better than the one that has to do everything. So you got to become well versed with the basics of NAHASDA. Exhibit 1's going to outline some of the areas which a recipient has to demonstrate proficiency to properly perform their admission and their occupancy functions within NAHASDA. So your requirements that you serve your eligible families, we're going to touch on that. Who's eligible? That you know your basic definition of your annual gross income, that you have a selection plan, and you show your preference. Who's going to get preference and how we're going to select our people. You have to have a maintenance and inspection in place, and basically guidelines and a policy there, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do your inspections on a yearly basis. When you're going to do them. Is it going to be on the anniversary of when you moved them in? Or are you going to do them all in September because that's a slow time? Eligible activities. We're going to have to talk about useful life. When you use any NAHASDA funds, it's going to tie back to that useful life, and you have to give a period of how long you're going to serve your low-income people with that component. Your policies, your adjusted gross income, your environmental requirements. You can't spend any NAHASDA money without taking a look at your environmental requirements. You have to be real careful with that one. Your waiting list, your insurance. You have to have insurance, but you're not usually taking care of the insurance, the contents. You have to make sure that your occupants know that and how they can protect themselves and maybe make it easier for them to get that. Verification, you have to know about the Uniform Relocation Act. Occupancy, conflicts of interest come into play a couple of different places, and your record keeping. As you notice, I'm not only Native, but I am part French, so you'll see me talking with my hands all the time. That's just how I do it. The remainder of Section 1 is briefly going to describe the areas identified, and as they apply to admissions and occupancy. Goes all the way to Section 15 or 16 that actually contains the appendixes that I showed you. Please make sure you look at them sometime within the 4 days. Eligibility for assistance based on your anticipated household gross income as determined by HUD annually, and we'll show you how you do that. Appendix 3 indicates the latest published income limits. Additional program-specific eligibility requirements, they apply, but vary depending on the type of assistance and the funding source. Although the focus of the training is NAHASDA, it should be noted that for different funding sources, they sometimes have different requirements. You generally go with the strictest requirements. If you're using NAHASDA and low-income tax credits, for instance, something funded with rural development are required to target residents with income levels that are actually even lower than NAHASDA. So you have to be prepared to address the requirements of your other funders when you leverage your NAHASDA funds with them. So under NAHASDA and the law, the purpose of NAHASDA, under Section 201, the objectives and eligible families, it states that the primary national objectives of the Act are as follows, and that's to assist and promote affordable housing activities, that you can develop, maintain, operate your housing programs in a safe and healthy environment on your reservation or other Indian areas for occupancy by low-income Indian families, to ensure better access to private mortgage markets for Indian tribes and their members, and to promote self-sufficiency among their members. When I started, it was probably halfway into my 28 years before there was a mortgage on our reservation. You just couldn't get a lender here. And there's places that still don't have mortgage products on their reservations because of the trust land status. To coordinate activities to provide housing for Indian tribes, their members, with federal, state, and local activities to further your economic and community development activities for your tribes and your members, and to plan and integrate your infrastructure resources for the tribes, and to promote the development of private capital markets in Indian country, and to allow for the markets to grow. So it will benefit your Native people. So it starts with eligible families. Assistance for eligible housing activities under NAHASDA are generally limited to low-income Indian families on your reservation or other Indian area. NAHASDA specifies 4 types of families that you can assist with your money. The primary target are your low-income families. A low-income family means a family whose income does not exceed that 80% of the median income for your area, as determined by the secretary, with adjustments for smaller and larger families. So it would be different, a $30,000 income for a family of 2 than a $30,000 income for a family of 9. So that's what they mean for smaller and different larger families. Except that the secretary can, for purposes of the paragraph, this is spelled out within NAHASDA, establish income ceilings higher or lower than that median income in their area. Necessary because of a prevailing level of construction cost, or unusually high or low family income. So if you're in Pine Ridge, where they, South Dakota, and some of the places where they have the lowest income in the United States, the secretary actually might lower that amount. Or if you're in Alaska, where the housing costs are up through the roof, and we're just now experiencing that triple and quadruple a rate for our lumber products. Well, they've dealt with it all along. I can't imagine what they're going through right now. But in those areas, the secretary can actually tweak that level of assistance. So the term median income means, with respect to an area that is an Indian area, the greater of, and you'll use the median income for that Indian area, or what the secretary determines, or the median income of the United States. You can pick the highest of those areas. You can also help service non-low income families. A non-low income family is one who is over that 80%, but less than 100% of that median income limit. You have to show and document where they have a need that can't reasonably be met without using NAHASDA funds or your IHBG assistance to help those families. As I said, you use those documents. So 1006, 1008, 1010 speaks to that. So that's what you would do. You'd come to your document, you go into 1000s, You turn it over till you find 106, 108, 110, and that'll speak to every single one of those areas. Under 1,110, under what conditions may a non-low-income Indian family participate in the program? And then it gives you all the guidelines. That's how you make sure that you're following the law. Just print these, look at those numbers, and read them every time you see it. So that you're going to have 3 different places where you're going to check, and that's how you go about doing that. If the recipient plans to use more than 10% of the amount planned for the tribal program year for such assistance, or if you plan to provide housing for families with income over 100% of median income. In the cases where HUD approval is not required, you still have to determine and you have to document that there's a need that those families can't be serviced without your help. Now, if you're serving somebody that's over 100% of median income, you need permission from HUD. So you have an essential family. An essential family can receive assistance if that family's housing need cannot be cannot be met without your assistance, and that you, the recipient, determine that that non-low-income family's presence is essential to the well-being of the rest of your Indian families living on your reservation or in your area. You have to deem them essential. A nurse, a doctor, a medicine man, religious pipe carriers. I've seen all sorts of, it's what your community deems as essential to your area. So your community and your board and your council will make that determination what you deem as essential, but you have to document it. I've seen some applications where it has the applicant say, I would like to apply for essential family status, and some applications that don't even speak to that. That's a discussion that you have once they are over income or you've determined them through that status. You can do it whichever way you want. I found it funny that people were coming in and deeming themselves essential when I did see it on an application. Your law enforcement officers. Section 201B of NAHASDA. So again, you'd go to your book, but this time you'd go to the NAHASDA statute and you'd go to 201B and find out what it says about law enforcement. And then that's how you find your guidelines there. It specifically addresses the provision of housing or housing assistance to law enforcement officers. The officer has to be employed full-time by, it doesn't matter if it's the tribe or not, it's federal, state, county, tribal, or other unit of local government. They have to be sworn to uphold and make arrest for violations of federal, state, county, tribal law. And they must determine that the presence of that law enforcement officer could deter crime. So even if they're over 80% of your income, you could put a law officer in under that. And they also, it doesn't count against your 10% authority. Some other times you can, if you write your policy, you talk to your council and your board of commissioners, you can have them come in and give them a reduced rent, even if you want to give them extra parole, patrol activities, things like that. You have to have you have to give them specific guidelines to what you expect out of them and what they have to provide to make that determination. But I've seen it done. State police officers were a huge deterrent here. I took everyone in that I could get, have that patrol park, that car parked out of that. It's a deterrence for crime. So you can find more information in Appendix 4, which is the program guidance. It shows you how to calculate annual income under NAHASDA. That guidance goes all the way back to 2013, but that's the most updated one, so that's the one you use. Sometimes that's confusing to a new employee. you think that something should be newer. Well, they don't always update things. And it's sometimes quite confusing to find out what is the most updated documents, especially when it comes to program guidance. But that's the newest one we have for calculating annual income. Appendix 5 goes back to 2014, and it's providing assistance to non-low income families. So that's all that document talks to, is to helping people that are above that guideline. So you have to have tribal preferences within your selection. And I do a lot of work with policy, and I do a lot of work on reservations, preparing people for their monitoring visits, and sometimes coming in after their monitoring visits. And you will see they'll get tagged for no tribal preference in their selection. You have to have that. How are you going to put them in there, and how are you going to get those points on that application? So the regulations at 24 CFR 1120 permits recipients to provide preference to Indian families, and we can do that because of the way the law is written, who are members of your Indian tribe, and to other Indian families. If the recipient has adopted the preference in the admissions and the occupancy policy, the recipient shall ensure that housing activities funded under NAHASDA are subject to preference. So you have to have those, and it extends also usually to preference and selection and employment. You usually write that preference policy to also make sure your tribal members are hired first and they're last out when there's layoffs. You reverse that order is how it's written. So that's one of the areas it speaks to, that you've got to have something in place. Applicable income limits. To meet the definition of low income, that annual income can, like I said before, not exceed 80% of that median income, with adjustments for smaller and larger families. Section 415 of NAHASDA defines that median income with respect to an area that is an Indian area, the greater of, and the median income for the Indian area, which the secretary shall determine, and that's the ones we use, or the median income for the United States. But when you go to do that, you can actually select whichever one is the highest. So to determine your income limits applicable to your area, you compare your local area median income to your national. That's published by HUD. If your project is funded solely, excuse me, by NAHASDA, choose the higher of the two, which should raise the limit of what a family can earn, and still be defined as low income within your area. Tribes located on large reservations. My husband's tribe, our sister tribe, I think they're in like 17 counties, a huge area. They're checkerboarded through. You can have more than one income limit through there. But in order to reduce that administrative burden, you can actually set the income limit for multi-county borough, I guess they call it, but it's a county reservation area, at the highest one you have of all of them. So that guidance is found at 2020-01. For right now, that's the newest we have under income limits. I expect to see one probably within a couple of months anyway, should be coming out. And it contains that latest published median income, MFI, they call it, for your assistance. So right now, under 2020, a family of 4 with a household annual income of $65,800 wouldn't actually qualify as a low income family if you used those 2020 income limits. So we have to have also a definition of gross annual income. The regulations at 24 CFR Part 1010 provide recipients with the option to choose any one of 3 different definitions of annual income for the purposes of eligibility. The definition of gross annual income under HUD Section 8, so 24 CFR Part 5, and then you go down to Subpart F, except when determining the income of a home buyer for an owner-occupied rehab project, The value of the homeowner's principal residence can be excluded in the calculation of assets. And it speaks to the census definition. Annual income is reported under the U.S. Census long form for the most recent available decennial census. That means the definition of the income used by the census, not the dollar amount reported. So it's the definition that they use. There's an IRS definition also. It's adjusted gross income as defined for purposes of reporting under the IRS, the Form 1040 series for individual federal annual income tax purposes, and that recipient should review the program participant's past IRS Form 1040s to obtain that information. On that 1040 form, it's on line 7. So the recipient has to identify within your policy how it defines income for purposes of eligibility. In section 4 of this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about it, and in appendix 4 of all those documents that I provided, under 2013-05, it actually talks about calculating annual income for the purposes of eligibility under NAHASDA. It'll help in that area. So, eligible activities under section 202, the statute permits a huge variety basically of activities to provide affordable housing to assist your low-income families that live within your housing units. You can get a better description basically within the appendix document 6. It gives you lots of ideas and different things that you can use and spend your funding on eligible activities. Implementing the following eligible activities requires admission and occupancy functions such as application processing, selection, management. Under housing assistance, the modernization or operating assistance for your 37 Act, so your older low rent mutual help housing. Your caveat there is you have to maintain that current assisted stock first and foremost. You have to take care of that housing. Eligible activities, development. You can do your acquisition, construction of affordable housing, reconstruction, rehab, site improvements, development and rehabilitation of existing utilities, necessary infrastructure, and utility services. You can do conversion, demolition, financing, your A&P, your administration and your planning. Energy efficiency, you can make them more energy efficient, mold remediation, and there's other related activities there. Housing services covers your housing counseling, your energy auditing, your self-sufficiency activities, tenant-based rental assistance. Under housing management services to assist your NAHASDA units, you can the preparation of work specifications to help loan processing, inspections, tenant selection, management of tenant-based rental assistance, operation and maintenance of units developed with funds provided with NAHASDA, and management of affordable housing projects. When I was with our housing authority, we would have our tribal members come in and we would run the credit checks right there. And then we would find, first of all, if they were credit worthy. If they weren't, we tried to prepare and rebuild that credit and then put them in the right niche, whether it be USDA, where you had to be really, really low income, whether they set better within the 184 program, or their home ownership should go toward a conventional mortgage, because we did have somebody that would do conventional mortgaging on the reservation. And then we tried to find the right thing and then give them down payment assistance. A lot of times, the land office was in our housing authority, the utility office. You'll often find out that the more pots and areas you touch, sometimes it's easier to have them all within reach, but it's more responsibility too. So Crime prevention, safety activities. Under section 2025, you can do your physical improvements such as speed bumps, fencing, bus shelters, employment of police or security personnel, equipment for security personnel, and your model activities. This category enables recipients to undertake affordable housing activities that are consistent with the law, but not included basically within that activity list that we just went over. HUD approval is required. Housing activities to carry out the purposes of NAHASDA, it has to be approved through HUD. They have 60 days to review your activity. You submit it as part of your IHP or an IHP amendment, basically at any time if it's an amendment. And it has to be for affordable housing activities or benefit your residents. Mine was one of them, we purchased a drug dog for the police department. Now, we could not employ that police officer, but we could buy the hot dog package and the hot dog or the drug dog and his training. It worked really, really well. But those officers, that's something else you have to make sure you look into, because that dog had to stay with that officer for his whole life. So you had to almost sign a contract with one of your police officers saying that they would do that. They usually retire with the officer. They go home back to them, but it stopped, a lot of things, and it helped with enforcement from the other areas because the Border Patrol wanted to use them and the different law enforcement agencies. So it built like a camaraderie. So it was very, very effective. ONAP has issued guidance on eligible activities, and that one goes all the way back to 2010-03. The recipient, based upon the needs and interests of the tribe, determines basically your program. No requirement under NAHASDA that recipients have to undertake any particular type of program, except that recipients from 37, like I say, have to maintain that housing stock. It states in your Indian housing plan what you're going to do. So you have to have, according to 203, NAHASDA requires that you have certain policies in place. It be your rent. The establishment to paragraph 2, you have to develop written policies governing your rent, your home buyer payments. What the method by which you're going to determine your rent. How are you going to come up with the amount? Is it going to be a ceiling? Is it going to be a flat? Is it going to be up to 30%? Is it going to be 15%? The maximum rent. In the case of any low-income family, you got to remember that you cannot charge them more than 30%. Even if you have a minimum rent, you have to make sure that that's one of the things. Well, they say you don't have to recertify on a yearly basis. Well, you got to make sure that if somebody loses their job, that you're not charging them over 30% of their income for rent. So that's the caveat. You have to have something in place to make sure that you're not overcharging them. Maintenance and efficient operations. You have to maintain the properties that you have. You have to own. Each recipient who owns or operates is responsible for funding the entity, for the housing developed or operated. You have to make sure that you maintain that stock. Such amounts may be necessary to provide for the continued maintenance and efficient operations of your future housing also. That subsection may not be construed to prevent any recipient from demolishing or disposing of Indian housing referred within that subsection pursuant to regulations. You have to let them know when you plan on demolishing any of that. A demo dispo. You have to maintain insurance coverage. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Each recipient shall maintain adequate insurance coverage for their housing units that are owned and operated and assisted with that grant. You have to have certain required policies, your eligibility for admission. Each recipient shall develop written policies governing your eligibility, your admission, your occupancy of your families assisted with monies under that act. Management and maintenance. Each recipient shall develop policies governing the management and the maintenance of your housing assisted with grant amounts. You also have to, doesn't matter the size, if you're small or you're large, you have to have operation policies in effect, essential for your good business practices, written procedures to facilitate fair and equitable application of your policies. It also requires policies beyond admission. Below are a sample of various programs offered by your recipients by which a policy is needed to manage the delivery of your program. You have to have programs. If you have tenant-based rental assistance, you've got to have the guidelines for it. Your uniform relocation assistance, mutual help, low rent housing, lease with option to purchase if you offer that, your housing counseling. If you're going to assist your elders, elderly assistance programs, senior citizens rental programs, if you do that. Down payment assistance, rehab assistance, home buyer counseling, if you should offer a revolving loan program. So you also have to have, excuse me, guys, you have to develop written occupancy policies that establish the requirements for continued occupancy, grounds for termination, your housing lease. It's got to be consistent with your lease requirements from Section 207 of NAHASDA. Your occupancy policy should not contain any unreasonable terms and conditions. It shouldn't require your property manager or owner to maintain, or it should. It has to, you have to, excuse me, maintain your housing compliance with your applicable housing codes. It requires the property manager or the owner to give adequate written notice if you're going to terminate somebody's lease or you're going to evict them. You have to have terms and conditions written in there for termination and eviction. Your maintenance and your inspection, you're required to develop written policies that actually define the responsibilities of your home buyers or your tenants. What's their maintenance responsibility? It's going to be different if they're in a low rent as opposed to a mutual help where they're trying to buy it. For the maintenance of those units assisted with your monies, you have to speak to your annual on-site inspections of your NAHASDA assisted units. You can find that under Section 403B of NAHASDA. Again, your insurance, you have to have insurance. It's got to be required for those housing units. Anything with your IHBG funds, that adequate insurance in an amount that'll protect the financial stability of your recipients' programs. It means that those housing units and privately owned housing units, if they're still under their useful life, have to be adequately insured for one of the two periods listed below. So the useful life, the affordability period of a recipient for a privately owned unit. So if you're giving them rehab or you built them a brand new home, you're going to establish that useful life period. And it's very important you pay attention to those. You're going to list that amount also in your IHP. Pay attention. It's, 20 years or more for a certain threshold. If it's under $5,000, it might be 6 months, it might be a year. Pay attention to those amounts. Make sure that you have that useful life document written up and that you track it. You'll get tagged on it if you don't within your monitoring. So that useful life affordability period of the recipient for that privately owned unit, the term of repayment or forgiveness, the agreement, if they received any type of IHB assistance for a privately owned unit, whether it be down payment or whatever. And you can look at Appendix 7. That's Program Guidance 2014-03. It's insurance requirements under the program. You should also have somebody kind of versed, especially like if you use Amrend or to explain to your tenants when they come in or when they pay off a unit, that they need this type of unit. But even your rentals, you We really suggest that you get contents insurance in case there's a fire. I'm going to cover the outside of the dwelling, but it won't be anything on the inside, except for the appliances that we own. So they realize, that they should probably have insurance. So useful life information is section 205A2 of NAHASDA. It requires that housing remain affordable for either the remaining useful life of the property, as determined by that secretary or the secretary, for such other period that the secretary determines is the longest feasible period of time, consistent with sound economic and the purposes of basically NAHASDA. Your useful life is the time period during which an assisted property must remain affordable. So they can, you don't give them $20,000 and they turn around 3 years later and sell it to somebody that's no longer low income. It's also referred to as the period of affordability. So the following activities are subject to useful life restrictions, regardless of the amount of funds invested in that project. When you do a housing rehab, when you do property acquisition, down payment assistance, new construction, or even weatherization, to a certain amount, to whatever that named threshold is. This is the common periods of time that people use for an affordability period. So if I'm doing energy assistance and I'm gonna go through and maybe replace a couple of doors and windows and I'm under $5,000, chances are, if I was using this one, it would be 6 months that they'd have to keep that house without passing it on or selling it to someone, or between 5,000 and 15,000, well, 5 years. That's a affordable period of time. Between 15,000 and 40,000, 10 years. Over 40,000, 15 years. And any new construction or acquisition of a newly constructed unit, it's usually a 20-year time frame. So that table provides an example of affordability. That's a very, very common one that you see out there. But you also make sure it matches up with the one that you have listed within your Indian housing plan. I've seen them conflict, where they have a rehab program and it's signed up for one amount, but then it lists something else in the IHP. Or the IHP is not as stringent as this one. It can be either way, but just make sure that they match and make sure they're reasonable and they're adopted. This is a procedure that you should have put in place, in your tribal council or your board of commissioners should have that adopted. Appendix 8, 8A, and 8 itself, because they spoke to it in 2014-09, and that had a lot of the agreements within it. And then in 2020, they came out and they basically tied it to the land. So there's a lot more in there. So I would suggest you look at both of these documents, especially if you haven't seen 2020s. Those basically tie it to the land. But to make sure that you're following those requirements. So environmental requirements. The recipient should be knowledgeable about environmental requirements described in 24 CFR Part 58. In addition to all construction and acquisition related activities, duties performed by admission and occupancy staff are subject sometimes to environmental requirements. Services provided include but are not limited to application and intake and processing, routine inspections, tenant-based rental assistance, down payment assistance, recertifications, housing counseling, revolving loans, housing rehabilitation, and maintenance. Your lead-based paint. Some places will require that you have that form in there. If not, you get tagged for it. It depends on when your units were built. I used to say, I don't have any, they're all new, I don't need to have this form in there. Well, I still need to know about lead-based paint if I'm giving down payment assistance, because that unit that I might acquire might have to deal with lead-based paint. So sometimes you can't always forget about it. Uniform relocation assistance, certain relocation and real property acquisition policies that apply to housing developed under NAHASDA. You can find that under 1014 and within Appendix 2 and 49 CFR Part 24. If that recipient, if you as a recipient don't have the authority to acquire real property through condemnation before discussing that purchase price, there's real specific rules to that. You have to inform the owner that the amount believed to be is a fair market value on the property. The amount must be based on at least one appraisal prepared by a qualified appraiser. The recipient also has to inform the owner that the recipient will be unable to acquire the property if negotiations don't result in an amicable agreement. The recipient has to request HUD approval of that proposed acquisition price before executing a firm commitment to purchase that property. If that proposed acquisition payment exceeds that estimate, that fair market value. So you have to make sure you know about uniform relocation assistance. A lot of people don't. You have to take all reasonable steps to minimize displacement of people, households, businesses, nonprofit organizations, farms, as a result of a project, if it's touched by those IHBG funds. If temporary relocation is necessary, the recipient must provide residential tenants and home buyers with reimbursement for all reimbursement for all reasonable out-of-pocket expenses incurred in connection with that temporary relocation, including the cost of moving to and from the temporarily occupied housing, and any increase in monthly housing cost, rent, utility cost. So if you're relocating anybody, make sure you call your HUD office and get some advice about it. A lot of times when you don't realize that that's going to happen is if you're doing an owner-occupied rehab, or you have meth in a unit and you have to relocate your people. There's very strict rules for this stuff, and you can get tagged pretty severely if you don't do it correctly. So call HUD and ask for help. They're there to help you. They're there to help you get out of trouble, but do it before you move anybody. I know when I did one back in the CAP time, what we had was a unit that we had completely furnished for them and the full cable packages, and we paid their utility bills while they were gone while we were rehabbing the house, and we had to give them so much notice, and there was a lot of red tape with that just to make sure, because we were asking people to move. They were moving back into their unit. When you move them and they don't move back in, well, another set of rules apply. So just reach out to HUD and ask for their help. That's what they're there for. Appropriate advisory services, including reasonable advance written notice, the date and approximate duration of your temporary relocation, if it's temporary, location of suitable, decent, safe, and sanitary dwelling to be made available. Where are you going to move them to? What are you going to do if you're going to put them in a hotel? The terms and conditions under which the tenant could occupy a suitable, decent, safe, and sanitary dwelling following the completion of your repairs, and the provisions for reimbursement if they have out-of-pocket, expenses. You're going to put them in a hotel, they can't cook. So just call and ask for help. So if it's necessary, the recipient has to provide relocation assistance for your displaced people at the levels described within Uniform Relocation Assistance. It's that Policy Act of 1970. It was amended, and you can look at 49 CFR Part 24, and it will explain more. You have to certify that you will comply with the Uniform Relocation Act. The requirements are also found at 24 CFR 1000.14, and you must maintain records in sufficient detail to demonstrate that you complied with those program regulations. So, other funder requirements. Tribes or housing authorities that leverage their IHBG funds with other federal, state, or tribal sources of funding are sometimes required to adopt additional policies and things as required by that other funder. If a project involves multiple sources of funds, the policy should implement the strictest set of requirements. For example, if IHBG funds are matched with a low-income housing tax credit, the policy must include the stricter income rules as required by the IRS when you're utilizing those LIHTC funds. So, okay, one more, and then we're going to go on break. Give us about 12 minutes. Tribes or housing authorities that leverage their IHBG funds with federal, state, tribal sources of funding may be required to adopt additional policies as specified by those funders. And if a project involves multiple sources, again, so it looks like I have a second one there. Make sure that you use your stricter incomes. So we are going to go on break, guys, till 3:15. I'm going to mute you so you don't hear me cough and drink, but I'm going to start right back up at 3:15 if we can. So send a text, check your mail, run to the restroom, get a drink, and we'll be right back. Okay, guys, we're going to start in a second. And we will be at conflict of interest. So there's conflicts of interest in admissions. I'll give it 20 more seconds so we can start promptly at 3:15. So what conflict of interest provisions are applicable? So under 2 CFR 200-318, so that would be that other big book that we would look under, that I highly suggest. It's the last appendix item in the list. 318 govern the procurement of supplies, equipment, other property, construction, services by recipients and subrecipients. When you go to the other language that was be found at 1030, 32, and 34 and 36 govern all the other cases. So that's one of the reasons you have to use those three books together. There is also program guidance 2002-13 that deal with the conflict of interest in housing admissions. You have to report a potential conflict of interest to ONAP. You have to disclose that to the public, that there could be a conflict of interest, the nature of the assistance to be provided to your individual, and the specific basis to which there isn't a conflict. It's to ensure fair and equitable treatment for all. To determine if a conflict exists, to disclose to the public and report to HUD prior to providing assistance, because sometimes HUD can actually make an exception. So if the family's low income and they qualify, that's not a conflict, but you still have to disclose of it. It's still required. And if the conflict is only apparent or perceived, you make those disclosures and you inform HUD. So there's several ways to make a public disclosure. One such way is to make that information available in the same manner that you would provide any other public information, where you would post your policies or whatever in a public disclosures area. The section of maybe your monthly meeting agendas also. HUD has to be provided with a copy of that disclosure if the recipient is a TDHE. You might want to disclose that to your tribe as well, but HUD has to receive it regardless. So applicability. If the program, the procurement of supplies, equipment, and other property, construction services, conflict of interest procedures that are found at 200-318 will apply. In all cases not governed by 318, there's other provisions. Those are found at 1030. Conflicts prohibited. No person who basically participates in decision-making process who could actually gain inside information with regard to NAHASDA. Assisted activities, basically, may obtain a personal or financial interest or benefit from any activity, except from the use of NAHASDA funds to basically pay the salary, or other related administrative costs. That's the only benefit that a person is supposed to gain. Such persons include anyone with an interest in a contract, a subcontract, or agreement or proceeds. Immediate family ties are determined by the Indian tribe or within your TDHE policies. So how long must a recipient retain records regarding exceptions made to a conflict of interest? You have to have those records for a period of at least 3 years if you should make an exception to your conflict of interest procedures. This is the conflict of interest guidance. It's at 2002-13. It comes about as of 2001 when the OIG did an investigation. They published their report, and finding number 6 actually had to do with they found that among the housing entities that they reviewed, there were undisclosed conflicts of interest and preferential treatment in the admission of their housing program. So maybe a tribal chairman said, I don't care what you do, get the sister-in-law. I don't care if she's 40th on the line, she gets the next house. So this is put into place so things like that don't happen. So people don't skip a line because they're related to the housing director or to the tribal chairman or whoever it may be. This is so that you pick the people that are duly next. Over half of the entities that they audited had no process to ensure adherence to your conflict of interest requirements in admissions, or made to eligible families, and no way to prove basically that all members of their tribes were treated fairly. So application of the requirements. The conflict of interest provision applies to anyone who participates in the decision-making process, who gains inside information to any of your activities. Such individuals would be, but are not necessarily limited to your housing staff, your housing or your tribal board members, members of your immediate families, and it actually extends to your business associates. Requirements can prohibit any other such individuals from benefiting from their position personally, financially, or through the receipt of special benefits, other than payment of their salary, as I said before. You can see the exceptions to the requirements later on. So your application should actually ask, do you or any member of your household have a family or business relationship with any employee of your housing authority, with the board of directors, your commissioners, or your tribal housing council? It extends to your tribal council. You need to know when somebody is applying if they're related to any of them. So any of your staff, any of your board, any of your tribal council. Notify HUD if they are, okay? If they fall into any of those. Now, how are you going to determine who that family is? Use your determination that who you would give grievance leave to, or have your board define it for that purpose. So you have to have a disclosure. Any tribal housing authority takes seriously any actual or potential conflicts of interest. We wish to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. We ask all applicants to disclose immediate family members, other significant persons, which could potentially cause a conflict of interest. The staff, tribal council, housing board of commissioners, for this purpose, we're going to consider immediate family members. They would include, but are not limited to, our spouses, our children, our parents, our siblings. Please list any relationship here, and that's how it would read on your application. In order to effectively comply with the conflict of interest requirements, you should have in place a set of procedures determining when a conflict of interest exists, for how you're going to report that to HUD and disclose it to the public as required by those regulations. A method of determining whether or not there's a potential conflict of interest with an applicant. Does that application ask them to disclose any personal, family, or business relationships with the housing entity decision makers? Does the housing entity maintain a list of people with immediate family or business ties? So do you know who the immediate family members are of your staff and your tribal council and your board? Any administrative steps for reporting a potential conflict of interest to your ONAP office, to disclose to the public the conflict of interest, the nature of the assistance which you're going to provide them, and the specific basis to which that selection of that individual was made. Exceptions can be, like I said, made to that provision. HUD's approval must be obtained through your local ONAP office if you need that made. Exceptions will be considered on a case-by-case basis. When making the exception, it can be shown to further the primary objective of NAHASDA. Before any exception could be granted, a public disclosure of that conflict has to be made, and a determination that the exception would not violate any tribal or applicable state law on conflict of interest. All your records relating to the exceptions made have to be maintained again for at least 3 years. So low-income individuals to whom the conflict of interest provisions would normally apply, your housing staff, board members, but who actually qualify, okay, they're low income, they're next in line, they've been on that application process all the way through, they did everything the right way. That's not a conflict of interest. It could be a perceived conflict of interest, but if they're truly low income and they were next on the line, it's not. So you just have to make sure that you document it all the way through on how they got to be placed and what kind of assistance you're giving them. Are you on there too? Mute you guys, there you go. However, the recipient must make a public disclosure of the nature of the assistance to be provided, such individuals and the specific basis for that selection. And the recipient has to provide its area ONAP with a copy of that disclosure before the assistance is provided to that person. So this is what a sample disclosure would look like. To the members of any tribal housing authority, today's date, it's a potential conflict of interest. It's not a staff member, it's not a board member, it's a council member. It's an immediate family member of a tribal council member. The above is applied and been determined eligible for services. The nature and basis of the assistance to be provided, because you're supposed to tell them what you're doing, we're giving them rental assistance for a rental unit. Please be advised that all public comments must be postmarked within 7 calendar days of the initial date of this posting, as indicated below. All conflict of interest comments have to be in a sealed envelope addressed. There's the address, and comments that are received will be reviewed at the next regularly scheduled board meeting. You're not going to consider any comments received after the end of this comment period, and then you've got the dates in there. The posting, make sure that you put what time that sign went up. This notice was posted on December 5th at 8 a.m. Where at? In the lobby of the housing authority. And then you have written in there when it was taken down. This notice was posted on December 5th. On the 12th day of December at 8:06, this notice was taken down by Jane Doe, the best office staff ever. So you make sure you also have on there the record of when it came down. You're going to disclose this to HUD. So we have a sample ONAP disclosure form, notification of potential or appearance of conflict of interest, today's date. It's regarding the following applicant. Well, this time you're going to be more specific because you're informing HUD at this point. Vice Chairman Hunky Dunk's sister. Per 24/1030, the Housing Authority Conflict of Interest Policy, it's to notify you and your office that this applicant is going to be provided assistance through our Housing Authority program. The person considered a potential conflict of interest for the following reason. Is it an employee of the Tribal Housing Authority? No. Is it a member of the board? No. Is it a member of the Tribal Council of any res? No. Is it an immediate family member of any Tribal Housing Authority? Is it an immediate family of the Board of the Commissioners? Nope, nope. The last one. It's an immediate family member of the Tribal Council of our thing. So you send that to them. Today's date, it's regarding the following applicant. Again, it's Vice Chairman Hunkadunk's sister, and she's immediate family of the Tribal Council. Per the Department of Housing Authority, of HUD, at the regulations 1030 through 36, we have to publicly disclose when we an individual directly affiliated with the organization has qualified and been selected to receive assistance. A potential conflict of interest is being disclosed because it is the vice chairman's sister, has applied for and met the requirements for participating in the low rent program. We put them in our lakeside apartments at any tribal place. She's going to be provided assistance with rental assistance selection for rental unit 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how we're assisting them. The following applicants have met all requirements of participation. This is her name. This is her relationship. Specific basis. Yes, she's American Indian. Yes, she's low income. Yes, it's a primary resident. And she met all criteria and was next on the waiting list. So therefore, it's really not a conflict of interest, but you have to still post it and you still have to mail it to HUD. 2002-13, you should be sure that you have a written and adopted policy required by NAHASDA for your selection, admission, occupancy, your rents charged in accordance with NAHASDA, and you also deal with those conflict of interest. They have to be reviewed to ensure that they don't contain provisions that inherently allow for a conflict of interest. And you have to make sure that you have the necessary policies and systems and control procedures, basically. If not, you need to have them written and adopted immediately. The policy should be made public. Copies should be made available to the public upon request. If the person receiving assistance is low income and they qualify, like I said, that is not a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest is when they're over that low income threshold, when they're between 80 and 100%. That would actually trigger, we kind of need some HUD approval here before we put them in here. If they're over 100%, don't do anything, do not pass go, notify HUD before you do anything. Your program guidance, 2002-13, compliance with your conflict of interest should be included in your self-monitoring also to show that you do that when you place people. They're also going to review your conflict of interest policies when they do your monitoring. Conflict of interest also applies to your contracts. When someone in a position of trust has a competing professional and personal interest, you have to make sure that those decisions come from an official capacity and that they don't stand to profit personally, that your interest don't have the potential to conflict with the best interest of your organization that you represent. So your non-federal entity has to maintain written standards that also cover conflict of interest in the governing and performance of your employees engaged in the selection of any type of contract, award, administration of contracts. No employee, officer, or agent can participate in the selection of an award or the administration of a contract supported by a federal award if they have a real or an apparent conflict of interest. Such conflict of interest would arise when your employee or your officer, your agent, a member of your family, immediate family, your partner, they actually say, of an organization which employs or is about to employ any of the parties indicated herein has a financial or other interest or a tangible personal profit from a firm considered for one of your contracts. Your officers and your employees must neither solicit nor accept gratuities, favors, or anything of monetary value from a contractor or parties to subcontracts. Non-federal entities can set standards for situations when that financial interest is not substantial or that gift is unsolicited of nominal value. Your standards of conduct actually have to provide for disciplinary action within your policy to be applied for violations of such standards by any of your officers, your employees, or your agents. So your policy, an employee could accept food, refreshments of a nominal value on an infrequent occasion in the ordinary course of a breakfast, lunch, or dinner meeting. Other meeting where an employee could properly be in attendance, or maybe accept unsolicited advertising materials such as pins, calendars. So basically, if you go to an NIHC Ameren meeting, you're allowed to pick up the stuff off of the tables. If you go to your housing, your meeting of all the housing authorities throughout the region, and there's specific vendors there, you can pick up their stuff, even though it's actually a vendor. But that's because it's out on the table, not high in value, offered to everybody, so. An employee shall not solicit or accept directly or indirectly any gift. This one has $100. I've seen them as low as 25. So this policy was written for $100 value. Other than a thing of monetary value from a person or an organization who is in the past or tends to obtain a contractual business or financial relationship or interest who could be affected by the performance or non-performance of the employee's official duty. By non-performance, we mean if you've got a housing inspector that's inspecting apartment buildings you have as a building inspector, maybe they would let things slide for the contractor if they were wearing around a coat and some brand new stuff, so that's what you have to. Your written standards of conduct required. No employee, officer, or agent can participate in that selection if they have real or apparent conflict of interest when they're a member of that immediate family. So you look at 1030 for that guidance. And like I said, you have to have written standards of conduct with respect to the organizational conflict of interest also. So this one would prohibit its agents for participating directly, making the award. This one actually uses a huge definition of family, but you have to come up with what your definition of close family is, not only for contracts, but for admittance within your programs. Prohibits its officers from soliciting gratuities. Personal experience, I used to not really think bad when we'd have somebody, he'd come in and he'd give all the maintenance guys shirts that they could paint in, until it was pointed out that there was going to be a bid opening and paint contracting was part of it. That looked like a conflict of interest. How would somebody want to come in for a bid opening and see the guy that they're bidding across on one of the employees' backs? It wouldn't look good. So you have to be careful even when you think it's not of much value. Like I said, that violation has to be in writing, how you're going to discipline them. That disciplinary action has to be in the policy, written down. You should also always tell them how you're going to communicate that policy. Disciplinary action will be taken to remedy violations of this code and could include verbal, written warning, formal reprimand, suspension, or dismissal. The level of disciplinary action will depend on the severity of the violation, the individual's prior behavior, the nature of the individual's position. Notice that the Tribal Indian Housing Authority communicates all of our requirements of this code during our orientations, our trainings, the bylaws of the Board of Commissioners, and its personnel and procurement policies. You have to make sure that you show how you disseminate, those things. There are places that actually put in 1 year prohibitions after someone leaves during your tenure and 1 year after. No commissioner, officer, or employee, governing body of the tribe, any public official who exercises any responsibilities or functions that they can't profit for over a year from the time they leave. Any commissioner or officer that acquired any such interest prior to the appointment shall immediately disclose their interest in writing to the housing authority. Such disclosure shall be entered into the minutes of the housing authority, and that commissioner or that officer or that employee shall not participate in any action of the authority relating to the property or contract which they have an interest. Violation of any foregoing provision of the section shall constitute misconduct in office. This selection shall not be applicable to the acquisition of any interest or obligation of the housing authority. So here's some wording for a prohibition for 1 year for any of your board members, tribal council, or staff. There's just wording here if you need it, but you need to have a lot of these policies in place. You should have a policy about the use of confidential information. Disclosure of confidential information to any person not authorized by the contracting officer to receive such information shall be a breach of ethical standards. Confidential information includes, but is not necessarily limited to, the contents of a bid prior to the bid opening, or proposal prior to a contract award using a competitive proposal. The names of the individuals or firms who are submitting bids. That's none of their, prior to the bid opening, or proposals prior to the contract award. So you should have that signed. I had no idea when break time is. I should have probably put up the break time slide while we were gone, but use of confidential information, generated information related to a procurement, cost estimates, contractor selection, any other information like that. It's a breach of ethical conduct for any current or former employee, officer, or agent to knowingly use confidential information for actual or anticipated personal gain, or for actual or anticipated personal gain of another person. So, organizing your admissions and your occupancy department. In addition to those requirements, the cornerstone of good business is to practice a written plan of operations. The important functions of a tribal housing program is to have fair and consistent processes to determine who's eligible. The task is usually performed by your staff, your A&O staff, who are designated by a huge amount of titles depending upon the size of your staff. The occupancy blueprint is what your participants and your staff rely on to achieve the goals and objectives of your housing program. Establishing an admissions and occupancy policy, staffing, file management, and reporting we're gonna touch on here. So recipients of IHBG funds face the challenge of designing a housing assistance program that respond to the housing needs of the community. Typical Native programs include rehab, down payment assistance, lease purchase, tenant-based rental assistance, 37 Housing Act, your mutual help, and emergency assistance if you offer that. Whether programs are operated by your recipient, whether you're small, large, you have to establish those admission and those occupancy policies that address what kind of assistance you're going to provide. TDHEs created by state laws sometimes have to consider all the state laws also when they're developing policies. An admissions policy development requires your recipients to understand your NAHASDA requirements. That's why I want you to really become familiar with those 3 documents. Develop reasonable policies for your discretionary areas in NAHASDA. Develop procedures that translate to mandatory and discretionary policies in action. Communicate, make sure you have that training on your procedures to ensure consistency. So the left hand does the same as the right hand, that you don't apply things different ways, that you monitor your policies and procedures to ensure that you have compliance by your staff. I often tell people when I go in and I review their policies, unless it's a mandatory policy, it says that you have to have in writing, don't put it in there if you're not going to do it. Take it out. You're a lot worse off. If you get into trouble and you say that I'm not going to have any abandoned cars, and something happens and they bring in a lawyer or whoever, and they go tooling through your projects and find 6 abandoned cars, 1 on block, none of them are licensed, guess what? You don't follow your own policies and you don't have a leg to stand on. So if you're not going to do it, take it out. That's my biggest piece of advice when it comes to policies. Unless it's something that's necessary, then you need to find a way to follow it. So monitor those policies and procedures to ensure that they're complied upon by your staff. Your policy should seek to provide that guidance to your housing staff in the performance of your everyday routine activities, to ensure transparency and decision making, to provide a defensible resolution when challenges arise, to ensure that all your staff are doing things the same way, promoting consistency and fairness, while also minimizing the potential for disputes and legal actions. Provide a foundation for sound management and supervision, and provide a basis for your auditors, your justification. So this is Exhibit 2.1, and it goes through some of the parts of your application. This is how we're going to get in here. We're going to submit a written application. They're going to calculate that annual income. We're going to make a determination if you're apparently eligible. We're going to notify that applicant of that apparent eligibility or ineligibility. And you have to lay out how you're going to do that. Your placement on the waiting list if you're found eligible. Pre-selection, determination of availability of an appropriate housing unit. You got a family of 6, I can't put you in a 1-bedroom, even if it is open. The applicant interview to update and certify that that information, your orientation, you're verifying. There's many, and we're going to get into that verification probably tomorrow. Using unit assignment, requested housing assistance provided. Do they need any special accommodations? Calculations of that payment. How much is it going to be? Execution of that contract or that lease. Your move-in inspection. Who's going to do it? Are you going to document it? Are you going to take pictures? Are you going to be able to prove that? Your punch list, if applicable. Make sure when your guys go in there and they say on a move out that they fix something, that it goes to the file that it's fixed. You'll get a finding for it if it's not. Your occupancy, compliance with occupancy standards, your ongoing counseling if you need early intervention, they're starting to miss payments or they're trashing their house or they're not cleaning it. Lease or contract compliance, maintenance, inspections, recertifications as it applies to program assistance. Collections, reporting, file management. So you need to establish your admissions and your occupancy policy. Appendix 10 includes a whole sample outline. We're actually going to go through that, I think, on the last day too, of the policies. And like I said, it depends on what type of programs you also offer. However, the process outlined within 2.1 describes many of the area policies and procedures they have to address. So how are you going to do them? Your policies represent the vehicle through which housing assistance programs are described. In addition to explaining those programs' substance, the policy are the source for describing who's going to be served. Even though NAHASDA identifies who's eligible for housing, recipients also identify more specifically who will be assisted. Some of the areas you can exercise your own self-determination is defining your family characteristics. Family includes, but is not limited to, a family with or without children, an elderly family, near elderly, disabled, single. How does your recipient distinguish it or determine that? Identifying your preferences. Who are you going to help? Who are you going to help first? Identifying priorities with preferences. Identifying areas where services will be provided. On this area of the reservation, we're going to have this type of. Those are some of the ways that you can be creative. Whatever you choose, you have to fully describe that within that policy. If you're going to have ceiling amounts, establish a minimum rent. Make sure you don't exceed that 30%. Identifying additional deductions and calculating adjusted gross income. You can say we're not going to $5,000 if it's an elderly person, we're not going to make them sign but you have to show where you met on it, you had a thorough discussion, whatever you decide to waive, and you weighed what kind of implication it was going to have on your program. And that was adopted with minutes. Just make sure you always have that proof. Staffing requirements. No two recipients are exactly alike. There's no one right way to organize and staff an operation. One thing is true for all recipients, you have to have capable, well-trained staff with a sense of teamwork. It's essential to good management. The personnel requirements managing day-to-day admissions, they vary depending on what you offer, the size, the amount, the availability of housing in the area, your community needs. So your staffing requirements can force recipients to rely on 1 or 2 staff to do multiple tasks in some places. Programs with adequate funding sometimes give recipients the advantage of hiring more people. Consequently, staffing practices require extensive multitasking. 2.2 identifies many of the duties that can be evolved depending on the size of your program, the availability of your labor force, other resources, how far it is away. So this is the exhibit I was referring to. It talks about receiving and processing applications for new and continued housing assistance, including down payment, emergency rehab, rental assistance, whatever you order. Do you have somebody that does the interviewing of the applicants to obtain additional information? I, as a housing director, sometimes did that. You know, when I first started, I had a really small staff, and then it got larger and larger, and we were able to expand on that. But one of my rules of thumb was don't ask somebody to do something that you're not willing to do. So I've even unclogged the toilet in my day, you know, when we didn't have somebody around to do it. So depending on where you come from, you know, it'll vary. So advising applicants on eligibility requirements, methods of selecting residents. This is how we do it, you know, verifying applicant information, contacting landlords, meeting with recipients, governing body, talking to your board and explaining why you have to do things certain ways. You know, you're going to have different people interact different ways, processing loans, conducting outreach, computing those monthly housing payments or that housing assistance. If you don't have that computer program, that can be a work of art sometimes and confuse people, you know. So assisting with the process of size suitability, reporting, who's doing your IHP and your APR. So it depends. Appendix 12 talks about sample job descriptions. It's got some in there if you need any for performing some of those admissions and occupancy functions. Your file management. Documentation ensures the recipient's eligibility to demonstrate accountability and compliance with your statutory and your regulatory requirements. That documentation is totally meaningless if you can't find it. This section kind of provides an overview of requirements for maintaining a sound record-keeping system, contents that should be in an applicant or a tenant file. Guys, it's the same way with your policies. Put them all in one place. Put them all in one box. Put them all in one drawer. Whatever you have to do, make sure the latest copy is there, and make sure you go through your records and find out that they were approved, and put the meeting minutes where you can show that they were approved right in the same file. Because when you get to your monitoring, or sometimes even your auditing, you will be tagged on that one, guys. And that's the worst thing that can happen. I've been in 5 housing authorities in the last year where they can't find it, or it's not the last copy, or you'll be working with the document and found out there's another one that's 2 years later, or it's got multiple dates on it, or it wasn't approved. Don't do that. Put them all in one place, find the latest one, and make sure you have the documentation, the meeting minutes where it was approved. Do that for yourself, and that will help so much when it comes to monitoring. So you have to demonstrate accountability and compliance with those requirements. You have to make sure that you can find them. So section 403B of NAHASDA, 1502 actually require a recipient of IHBG to complete an annual self-monitoring assessment. Do it during your self-monitoring. Find your list of policies you should have and make sure that they're all together as part of your self-monitoring. Legal responsibility. Your recipients and applicants, participants, they have rights. Those rights are protected by those agreements. Excluded by all parties. Those documentation, that excellent file management, and those practices ensures enforcement of those rights. You have to establish records, a management system that meet NAHASDA's regulations. which require recipients to perform self-monitoring regularly, annually. You need to establish written procedures for identifying the types of files you're supposed to maintain, documentation required for tenant and programmatic files, the way they're supposed to be retrieved and stored. There's only certain people that are supposed to have access to those files. Procedures should be written to ensure the understanding and that compliance. Exhibit 2.3 provides an excerpt from a TDHC's admissions and occupancy policy that outlines file requirements. So each applicant and tenant file must contain documentation of any verification efforts, including but not limited to your household composition, your names, your relationship to the head, birth date, social security numbers, tribal affiliation. Watch me jump, guys, my own thing. That's my 5-minute warning. Status of live-in aides, foster children, income, the amounts and sources of income of your family members, your family assets, deductions from income for your rent computation, admission preferences if you have any, screening information, your tenant history, credit history, home visit record, your criminal history. And if you're using or utilizing that National Crime Information Center, you have the right to go out and get that criminal record information. This section basically speaks to 1152, which gives you the right to go through and get your own ORI number and run a criminal lien. You guys have that right. You have the right also to run that criminal lien on your employees to make sure that they're safe to interact and go into your homes and things like that. So the recipient might wish to have a policy that restricts or forbids occupancy of tenants who've had criminal convictions, sex offenders. One of the things that I would not allow is somebody that had B&Es. You don't want to have knowledge of somebody that has broken into units and then put them into an apartment and have them break in somewhere. But you have the right to do that thorough screening because your job is to protect those tenants. Your Indian tribe and TDHE will receive that criminal conviction information on your applicants, anybody over the age of 18. And it's required under Section 208 of NAHASDA, the National Crime Information Center. Those police departments and law enforcement are to provide that criminal conviction information to you. If you have a hard time, utilize your tribal attorney, show them the statute. A lot of times you have to show them, and explain that you have the legal right to this and find a way to run that criminal lien. For purposes of this section, tenants include home buyers who are purchasing. You have that right to that background. So how is the recipient to use criminal conviction information? For adult tenants and applicants, the recipient shall use that criminal conviction described in 1150, that information only for screening, lease enforcement, and eviction actions. So for those three purposes, a word of advice, or I didn't know this until probably over 15 years in, that standard HUD form that everybody for that release of information, it's got an expiration date on it. Look at it. Make sure that it's not. So and that's another reason you should be recertifying your tenants. Have them redo one of those every time so you have the right to that information. So with regards to applicants for employment, you can use that criminal conviction information for the purposes set out in the section of NAHASDA to make sure that your employees are safe to be working with your tenants. It can only be disclosed to a person who has a job-related need for that information, who is an authorized officer, employee, or representative of the recipient or the owner of the housing assistance by NAHASDA. You have to make sure that you you limit the access to that information. You have to keep that criminal conviction record information totally separate from your other files. It speaks to it in 1150, separate from all housing records. Criminal conviction records should be kept under the lock and key in the custody of your recipient housing's executive director or your lead official. You can also designate one other person. It's got to be in writing when you make that designation that somebody else has the right to those records. These criminal conviction records may only be accessed with the written permission of your Indian tribe's executive director or that lead official, only to be used for purposes stated within 208 of NAHASDA. Your tribal council can't just see them. You have to come up with a way to what we did was, if it came to the point, maybe I'll explain this tomorrow. They didn't see, they learned what the contents of the criminal conviction were. But at first, they made a determination with only the knowledge of it was a tribal member. This was their tribal member, non-tribal member. This is their birth date. So they knew the age, they knew the sex, and they knew what they did. And then they voted up or down. Only certain ones even got to that level. Okay. And then if they decided that they were going to prohibit them from coming into housing, that's when we notified the tenant. They had the right to grieve it. Once it became into the grievance procedure, they got to see who they were dealing with. So make sure you have a good procedure for the use of those. You have to establish a system of record management that ensures any criminal record received is maintained confidentially. It's not misused. It's not improperly disseminated, and it's destroyed once the purpose for which that record was requested has been accomplished. And you have to destroy it properly also. They have to be kept under that lock and key, like I told you about. The record should be destroyed. And there's additional information at 1152 and 154. There's a sample policy for filing requirements. All applications are filed active, inactive. File management: when an applicant is placed on a waiting list, that applicant and all supporting documentation is maintained in an active file. All applicants' files are organized alphabetically. If it's inactive, the applicants who are determined to be ineligible for whatever reason are placed in an inactive file, organized alphabetically for that fiscal year or by a fiscal year. Inactive files will be set up in a database indicating name, address, bedroom size, income, and date. Your file retention: all inactive files are retained for a minimum of 3 years. All active files are retained for 5 years after move out, or outstanding issues are resolved, whichever is greater. Your inactive file placement: those waiting list applicants will be placed on an inactive waiting list when treated as follows. When your staff has made that determination of ineligibility, and that confidential information contained within that file, it's confidential. Only those with the need to know have the right to review the contents of a client file. Staff is prohibited from discussing the contents of a client's file with anyone but the staff. Tribal officials have to have a court order to access applicant or occupant information unless that applicant or occupant signs a consent form releasing that information to that requesting policy. Same thing with your drug abuse treatment files. Has to be set up like your criminal things in separate files. Has to be in a separate file from your other ones. File organization talks about, basically files need to be established for each applicant. The type of folder used by the recipient depends on the size of your program. Exhibit 2.4, which is coming up, actually shows you how to tailor the requirements. A recipient who provides intense housing counseling may want to use a separate folder basically for that stuff. File retrieval: this is a sample, section, and we have copies of all my PowerPoints, guys. How to set up the inside of a file. This is how they should, left side, right side. A file checkout: if you have more than a couple of employees, you need to make a file checkout. So if you one of your staff pull a file, you insert that in there, and you know who's got the file. You don't have to go running all the way around the office to find it. Those forms, INIC 26 are tools housing counselors may use to maintain accurate records of activities. Housing counseling don't always follow a natural progression from start to finish. So there's often new information and changing circumstances which a counselor has to track. A good record keeping system is the foundation of providing good service to clients. Here is some of the housing counseling files that's used when you could use them. This is again that list of appendices, and we are to the question and answer point. If you want to release the Kraken, Cora. If not, guys, I will see you tomorrow. We start again at 2:00. Good night, and I'll talk with you tomorrow.
Yes. You go ahead and type out the questions in the chat if that's a little bit better for you guys. And as we wrap up for today, you will be able to access today's presentation on YouTube. So we are going to be posting the recording. So if you need to go back and revise anything, this will be available at the end of the week. And we went ahead and put in the chat the link for all of the materials. It'll be updated on a daily basis. And please feel free to check out any of our upcoming events on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, and Twitter. We also have the Hobothenia podcast, which you can listen to on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. And we really do thank you for joining us today. And we are so excited to see you guys tomorrow for part 2. If you have any questions, like I said, feel free to start typing them in the chat, and maybe we can do a quick Q&A tomorrow to answer those questions. Thank you.
They asked about the appendix items.
Say that again, Cheryl.
They want the appendix items. How do they get them?
The appendix items are on the website. So you're going to see the PowerPoints, and they're going to be labeled by day, and the appendix items are also on the website for you guys to download. So everything's going to be there for you guys. Yes, thank you. There was a comment a little earlier by Sherry Subon saying, can we copy this? I'm not exactly sure what she wanted to copy. So Sherry, if you're still with us and you want to go ahead and ask that question, this is the time.
Yes, but any of my policies that say any tribal housing entity, yes, you can copy those parts. They're samples for you. A lot of information already. Good job. Oh, Colville. Colville is some of the best for you guys that haven't been around the block. They do some great policy work, procedure work. I've seen it around for years, so that's a good compliment. Thank you very much. Okay, so it looks like that's it. I'm not seeing any question. Thank you. I saw Amber's.